It is just so wonderful, Marcene, to have you here working with us at WWF. For me personally, I think really forged a close connection. And I think with you, we stand to do some great things in the climate space. Just to step back a little bit, and before we hired Marcene, just relay some of the work we did in terms of ensuring that we elevated climate as a core area of our work. We took stock of our comparative advantages. We talked to foundations and other major partners and got an in-depth survey and a response in terms of where we were good and where we needed to exit work in climate and really understand our comparative advantage. We decided to reframe the job to create it almost as a climate czar, responsible for coordinating climate across our work and across each of our goal teams, and to deliver in a big way against the two sides of the climate equation, one being mitigation and the other being climate adaptation and resilience. And so Marcene's job is to do just that. And she started with a bang, and you'll hear a little bit about some of the work she's doing and her thinking in a minute. We're so incredibly lucky to have you here, Marcene. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and I know we're a bit short of time, so I'm only going to ask you two, and the second will be, the handover, so you can take this conversation forward together with your team. But the first question is, tell us your story. How did you end up with the job at WWF?
Well, great. Well, thank you, Nick, very much. And I'm thrilled to be here, as you can imagine. So, I mean, I came from a family that really valued nature. And even though I grew up and have always lived in and around cities, I have spent a large amount of time in nature. I'm from New England. And so everywhere from the mountains and ski slopes in northern New England to the coastlines and the beaches and to Cape Cod. And it's really been a big part of my childhood. I'm also a very mission-oriented person, and I worked at the World Bank at the IFC, the private sector arm, which focused on key issues of our time of poverty reduction and boosting shared opportunity, which led me to my work in climate change as Catherine said, one of the key issues of our time, and certainly for development in emerging markets. And the opportunity at WWF has given me a chance to work in a mission-oriented organization, which combines my love of nature and my knowledge and experience in climate change. So for me, it was a triple win. And it really came home because during the pandemic, my little silver lining in the pandemic was that I live in Washington, D.C., where we have this glorious park called Rock Creek Park. And every day I would get out and I would spend a little time in nature, and the restorativeness of that connection to nature really made me feel that this is something that we all need to do, right? As humanity, we need to have that connection a bit more with nature. And I feel like working at WWF will give me that chance to be in promoting the conservation of nature, as well as addressing this crisis of climate change.
You know, we've seen renewed energy in the climate space as of late, from the Biden administration resetting environmental policy, to the corporate commitments we're seeing to address climate change, to the rise of non-state actors and the voices of global citizens calling for action on a scale we've never seen before as we inch closer to the UN climate conference in Glasgow this November. So in that context, we're hearing a lot of buzzwords and phrases, things like whole of society approach and nature-based solutions. What does this mean to you? And how will WWF be working to ensure we seize this momentum?
Right. So, you know, we are all experiencing the more frequent and intense wildfires, droughts, these heat waves, hurricanes, and we're reading about the rising sea levels and the melting glaciers. So there's no question that climate crisis is here today, and it's a question of what we do about it. We particularly see a disruption of this crisis in every community and the ecosystems that WWF cares about. And it represents the greatest collective action in human history in order to address this crisis. But fortunately, humanity is not in this alone. Nature also plays a critical role, and that's nature-based solutions. WWF is uniquely positioned to support our efforts to minimize the impacts of climate change. So we recognize this critical role of nature itself in the effort and to have the expertise to harness effectively, both to decrease greenhouse gas emissions and also minimize the impacts of climate change that are going to come no matter what we do. We also understand that we need a cleaner and more equitable society to address climate crisis, and we have the relationships and the trust across public, private, and the nonprofit sectors to build the momentum that you just spoke about. It's a very exciting time for us. The new administration has just come in, and in a matter of months, they've inspired a new optimism in the effort to tackle this climate crisis. Over the first 100 days of the Biden administration, President Biden has begun to implement an agenda that recognizes and respects the critical role of nature in our lives and is delivering a response to the climate crisis that matters and matches the gravity of the challenge. By rejoining the Paris Agreement, which is very critical. We've been out for 4 years. He's announced new ambitious targets for reducing our own US emissions and pledged to increase America's investment in international climate solutions. And all of these have put America back on the road to reestablishing US as a global leader on climate action. And the momentum is growing in the broader public as well. So according to a recent Gallup poll from March this year, 59% of Americans now recognize that we are already seeing the effects of global warming. And a Yale study shows that support for congressional action to address global warming is at 60%. So that's really good news. But we must recognize this didn't happen in a vacuum. And the work of WWF over all of these years with our partners and millions across the country has made this momentum and this agenda that President Biden is now progressing possible. We have been building this ever since the Paris Agreement was signed over 5 years ago. And we now recognize that the goal is to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, which was once thought beyond reach, but now again is a real possibility. And so not only did WWF drive this momentum, but we stand ready to harness it across several moments this year and to launch a decade of implementation of climate action. So today you'll hear from some of our experts on the climate team about how we do our work. And basically, there are 3 major ways that we address the climate crisis. One is to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emitted into the atmosphere. And you'll hear how we are building that momentum through engagement with the private sector and cross-sector coalitions around the world. Second is to expand carbon sinks that can remove these gases from the atmosphere and lock them away. And that's our work on nature-based solutions. And I'm excited, you're going to hear one of our innovative initiatives in seedweed that's funded through our 100 million grant that we received from the Bezos Earth Fund. And finally, our efforts supporting to adapt to climate changes, adaptation and resilience for the changes that are coming and our most vulnerable communities, how we protect and work with them. So to help tell this story, let me first introduce Marty Spitzer, Senior Director of Climate and Renewable Energy. In this role, Marty leads the organization's efforts to accelerate corporate leadership on climate and energy. Marty, over to you.
Thanks, Marcene. I'm going to start and talk a little bit about private sector action to get us going. I want to start with saying one thing. The bar for corporate climate leadership is higher than it's ever been. I've been at this for a while and I've seen firsthand the remarkable progress over many years. And WWF has been at the forefront of helping raise corporate ambition and redefining corporate climate leadership. In the early days of corporate climate action, leaders would have been considered companies that were changing out light bulbs for compact fluorescence or changing their air conditioning and HVAC systems, and disclosing their emissions to the public. But today, so much has changed. Leaders are making dramatic efficiency improvements, setting 100% renewable energy goals, and driving emissions down in their supply chains and during the use of their products. And we call that their value chain. The companies are moving beyond science-based targets. More companies are setting net zero goals now. Some are committing to eliminate the emissions they've made in their entire history. The recent corporate net zero commitment headlines you can see on the screen now are just really exciting and give you an idea of what's actually happening. Now, to help companies set a North Star for their ambition and to ensure they're reducing emissions in line with their climate science and across their operations and their value chains, WWF helped create the Science-Based Targets Initiative in 2015. This global initiative establishes standards and approves targets for companies who want to set greenhouse gas reduction goals that are aligned with science. The initiatives become the platinum standard for companies setting targets with the highest integrity, and we keep strengthening the criteria as the science improves. Now, companies that set ambitious climate goals or are trying to reach them will have to reduce emissions in their operations, across their energy use, and across their value chains. Now, the good news is that the companies with these ambitious commitments are increasingly looking to invest in what we call nature-based solutions, and Carter talked about it already. Nature-based solutions, they harness the power of nature to tackle the climate change and some of our most pressing societal challenges, like clean air, water and food security, natural hazards like wildfires and extreme weather. Now, with all this ambition, companies are also worrying that they can't meet their reductions from within. So they're starting to ask questions about how they can buy offsets to meet their goals. And in the climate world, offsets they're called carbon credits that someone can buy from a project that might protect trees from being cut or regrowing trees, and many other activities that they can use to offset their emissions. But one problem with offsets and carbon credits is that they aren't always as impactful as they need to be. And sometimes companies want to invest in carbon credits outside their operations or value chains before they've done the hard work to reduce their own emissions. Now, companies are often appropriately accused of greenwashing when they do this sort of stuff. Now, we can't afford that old approach anymore. That's why WWF has developed a blueprint for corporate action on climate and nature. This is to ensure companies' investments are as impactful as possible. Now, the blueprint guides companies to a holistic approach aligned with science, calling on them to disclose their emissions, exhaust investment opportunities by reducing emissions in their own operations, their energy use and value chain, and then to make financial commitments to internalize the costs of those remaining emissions that are left over, and then to invest in impactful climate and nature-based solutions. As I mentioned earlier, the North Star for corporate climate action is science-based target. These targets are growing rapidly. More than 1,000 companies globally have now set or committed to set a science-based target. This chart on the screen from a new report called Power Forward 4.0, released by WWF yesterday, shows the percentage of Fortune 500 companies that had set any climate goal at all in 2014, 17, and 21. Now, as of today, 60%, this is the right column, of the Fortune 500 have set a target. That's up 12 percentage points from 2017 and 17 percentage points from 2014. That's great news. There's more good news. The green slivers of this pie chart show you that 100 Fortune 500 companies have set or formally committed to set a science-based target with the initiative since 2015, and another 50 have publicly intended to set one. Now, the less rosy side of the 60% picture we saw on the previous slide is that this means that 40% of Fortune 500 companies have not yet set a target. Furthermore, we see here only 1 in 5 has set a science-based target. And looking at the most ambitious net zero-like targets, and there are very few of them overall, there are no standards for comparing one to another, so it's hard to judge their integrity. The SBT initiative is going to put out guidance on these commitments later in the year, so that should help. But For now, the bottom line is we see strong leadership from some companies in the private sector, but not enough to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees. That's why we can't rely on voluntary action from the private sector alone to address the climate crisis. We need strong federal and state climate policy to ensure that the private sector's commitments are as ambitious as what science shows we need. Now, companies can and must play a leadership role here too. To guide companies on what they should do on climate policy, WWF created the AAA Responsible Policy Framework that ensures companies can only claim the mantle of climate leadership if and when they advocate for policies that are consistent with net zero by 2050, align their trade associations' climate policy advocacy to be consistent with the goal of net zero by 2050, and very importantly, allocate their advocacy spending to advance climate policies and not obstruct them. Companies like Google have been deeply involved in energy policy. McDonald's recently led a corporate effort on renewables in the COVID relief bill. Other partners like Johnson & Johnson and Procter & Gamble and others are fellow members of the Climate Leadership Council, which is advocating for a price on climate. Over the last 6 years, more companies have stepped up to lead the climate fight, setting science-based targets, scaling renewable energy purchasing, driving reductions across their value chains, and supporting strong climate policy. Even so, climate science is telling us that we have to move more quickly, and it's critical that business heed that call. So to close, I want to share a short video from a recent dialogue with CEOs of some of the largest companies in the country, our own CEO, Carter Roberts, and President Biden's special envoy for climate change, John Kerry. I think it shows how far we've come, how far we have to go, but also that we can get there if we work together. So thank you.
All the companies on this panel, along with 100 others with more than $3 trillion in combined revenue, have publicly supported a strong new U.S. Paris commitment through a joint letter to President Biden.
I had the privilege of leading our team in Paris, and now we're heading to Glasgow. What compels me, and I think President Biden more than anything, is the fact that we're just way behind. We need to bring the private sector to the table. That's why I'm so pleased to be here with these CEOs.
Can't do it alone. We really need a global policy framework that has real teeth in it, real commitments.
Secretary Kerry, we want your help with enabling the global evolution of sustainability, particularly water conservation and renewable energy.
What keeps me up at night is just the enormity of the change that we are trying to make and the fact that it is on a planetary scale.
Global policy is very much on our minds. So Secretary Kerry, it's great to have you working across countries to help make this whole thing come together.
This is the biggest thing we've ever tried to do, but it is doable. The CEOs assembled here are absolutely critical to creating this momentum that we need.
As a restaurant company, I mean, for us, climate change literally is an existential risk. We're in the process right now here in the US of bringing online renewable energy that will power 8,000 of our 14,000 restaurants.
We set this goal of 100% renewable energy in our 3,000 plus stores, DCs, distribution centers, and headquarters by 2030.
We think people will want to work for companies that have the right values, companies that are having positive impact in the world.
And what we learned was it took more than just us and our suppliers. It's about all of society having a voice in the decisions that we make.
I would urge corporations to use policy engagement and advocacy for policies that go for net zero and aligning and allocating their spend along those as well.
You are transforming your businesses. Grateful for your work with us to move the needle on this issue in the very most serious way.
Thank you, Marty. So you touched on a critical piece of our overarching work on climate there, ambition. And even with the efforts of the most productive private sector partners, we are not seeing the ambition that sector alone to meet our climate goals. At WWF, we see the need for action across beyond any one sector. We need all of society to step up. And so many of you would have heard of We Are Still In. And this was the coalition that came into being to be the voice of the United States and their continued commitment to achieving the goals of the climate agreement under the previous administration. And this coalition grew from a single signing statement to a huge coalition and has become a movement that continues even now in this administration under a new moniker, America is All In. And what is more, the model of cross-sectional collaboration, cooperation, and action has inspired similar coalitions around the world. WWF has created a global community of coalitions under the Alliances for Climate Action. And to tell us more about these alliances and the implications of their work is Mariana Panuncio-Feldman, Senior Director for International Climate Cooperation. Mariana?
Thank you, Marcene. Earlier, Marcene, you mentioned that climate change is the greatest collective action challenge in human history, and you're absolutely right. Individuals and communities cannot solve this global challenge alone, and I think it would be unfair to expect that they should. As Marty and Special Envoy John Kerry mentioned, the progress that we have seen from some of the largest US companies through their voluntary actions is critically important, but it is not enough. Even national governments will not be successful if they have to solve the climate crisis alone. The climate crisis poses such an existential and all-encompassing challenge for all of us here on this planet that we require that every sector of society play a part. And this needs to happen not just in the United States. It needs to happen here in the United States and everywhere around the world simultaneously. We know that in the next 10 years, we need to cut global emissions in half, and that in the process, we need to begin a deep transformation for how our societies function and how we address development needs so that we can collectively support greater human and planetary well-being while reaching a balance between what we emit and what we absorb, what is called net zero emissions by 2050. This is no small task. But WWF is uniquely poised to contribute. Through our global presence, our established relationships with communities, governments, companies, and other institutions in every corner of the world, and our convening power, we have been playing an important role in inspiring more institutions to act and sparking the kinds of collaboration that are needed to address climate change. This need for unprecedented collaboration is something that even the Paris Agreement recognized. The landmark treaty created to address global climate change and signed by 196 countries calls on every country to set national targets for emissions reductions and climate preparedness so that together we can keep global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and below 1.5 degrees if possible. The agreement explicitly recognized the role of local and regional governments, businesses, investors, civil society, faith and academic institutions, all of these actors known as subnational actors, as critical to delivering climate action at the scale, speed, and level of ambition that is needed so that our global goal of keeping temperature rise below 1.5 remains within reach. Through the Alliances for Climate Action initiative that Marcene mentioned, WWF and our partners have successfully mobilized subnational institutions in key countries around the world. Right now, our effort is already spanning 4 continents, and further growth is anticipated this year. Alliances for Climate Action helps bring together cities, states, companies, and other so-called subnational institutions that are committed to addressing climate change, but it's doing so at the national level so that together they can drive the transition to net zero societies in their own countries. These coalitions work together to achieve 3 fundamental objectives. Grow the base of climate action in each country by elevating local institutions who are leading by example, and with their help, encouraging more institutions to take climate action and to implement actions jointly. These alliances also work to engage the public in their countries so that together they can speak about the urgency and the economic, social, and environmental benefits of reducing our carbon footprint. This is key because this is credible messengers who are from the country speaking in their local language about their local reality. This resonates with the public and people at large. And these alliances also support constructive engagement with their respective national governments, calling for national targets and policies that support rather than obstruct ambitious emissions reductions. And by doing this in multiple countries at the same time, WWF and partners are together strengthening the global movement to address the climate crisis. So far, Alliances for Climate Action has mobilized over 6,000 institutions across the Americas, Africa, and Asia in countries that together account for almost a quarter of global emissions. These alliances are already playing a critical part in influencing climate policy targets of their national governments. So let me give you a few examples. The most well-known, as we discussed before, Marcene mentioned, is We Are Still In, now rechristened as America is All In. Over the past 4 years, the coalition demonstrated to the world the continued commitment to climate action within the United States, despite the fact that the federal government had stepped away from its responsibility. Now, under a new Biden administration, the coalition called for high climate ambition and lent valuable support when the United States put a new economy-wide climate target on the table last month, a commitment to reduce US emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. Perhaps less familiar to US audiences is the role that the Japan Climate Initiative, the Alliance for Climate Action in Japan, played in providing Prime Minister Suga the political space to commit to a more ambitious climate goal for Japan. Prime Minister Suga recently announced the commitment of Japan to reduce emissions by 46% and stretch itself to 50% emissions reductions by 2030. The Japan Climate Initiative spent months advocating for that high ambition. And in South Africa, the Alliance for Climate Action South Africa was the leading voice in calling the government of South Africa to embrace a goal of net zero emissions by 2050, which the government of South Africa took on. These developments represent just a few examples of the growing momentum for global climate action that WWF is helping build ahead of another important moment later this year, the meeting of national governments under the Paris Agreement, known as the Conference of the Parties, or COP26, that will take place in Glasgow, Scotland in November 2021. This year is particularly important because all countries must come to the table with commitments that show how each country will reduce its own emissions by 2030, implement deeper reductions by 2050, how they will adapt to a changing climate, and for those who can, how they will help others finance these efforts. And this could not come soon enough. As I mentioned before, the world must cut global emissions in half and must prepare for the impacts of a warming atmosphere is already bringing upon us. As the world recovers from the COVID pandemic, it is critical. This is our opportunity to recover smarter, stronger, and better, tackling the climate and the nature crisis at the same time. The COP must be the moment when the world pivots from planning to implementation with demonstrated political will from national governments and the whole of society behind them. At WWF, we are building the global momentum to make this happen. So as this pivot from planning to implementation begins in earnest, it is important to acknowledge that climate change is not waiting for us to act. We have already seen impacts every day in our lives here and around the world. So I am now going to introduce my dear colleague, Shaun Martin, Vice President for Ecological and Social Resilience, to talk more about how WWF is leading the way on adapting and prepare for these impacts. Shaun?
Thank you, Mariana. Achieving the promise of Paris is going to require more than society reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. Nature also has a vital role to play in storing carbon and protecting people from floods, heat waves, and drought. Last year, WWF released guidance with 8 simple recommendations for governments to incorporate the power of nature in their national climate commitments. And the UK government, which as Mariana mentioned, is hosting this year's International Climate Conference, is using these guidelines to champion what we call nature-based solutions to address the climate crisis. But it's not only national governments that can help manage nature to benefit the climate. Communities have an important role to play as well. This is especially true in tropical coastal areas where mangroves are crucially important in fighting climate change. These mighty ecosystems are 4 times more powerful than tropical rainforest in absorbing carbon. And they also provide protection from storm surge and coastal erosion from communities that live close to the coastline. WWF is playing a significant role in promoting community-based climate solutions. With the support from the Bezos Earth Fund, WWF is working to protect and restore mangroves in Colombia, Fiji, Madagascar, and Mexico. But just for a moment, imagine you live in one of these countries, along the coasts in a place like this. These are your neighbors. And this is your home for you and your 4 children. Someone promised that if you protected mangroves, you would continue to have fish in the sea. And if there was ever a storm, the mangroves would be there to protect you, your family, and your property. What you don't know is that tomorrow your village will experience the strongest storm that your country has ever experienced. You're unaware of this danger because your village has no early warning systems, and there are no emergency shelters. When the winds begin to pick up, you think, surely this can't be happening again. The storms are coming so much more often than they used to. And you've barely got back on your feet after the last cyclone. You and your family survive, but you've lost your home. Now you have to rebuild. Unfortunately, to get the wood you need to reconstruct your house, you're going to have to cut down the mangroves you were told to protect. This is an image of mangrove wood for sale after a cyclone in Mozambique. In fact, WWF has found that vulnerable people, when they're unprepared for climate change and extreme weather, they often resort to degrading nature to survive. They clear forests to grow food when their crops fail. They kill wildlife that compete with their livestock for water in times of drought. And this only serves to increase their vulnerability to the next extreme event. And it undermines the very nature-based solutions the entire world needs to address the climate crisis. Climate change has put the world's most vulnerable people at increased risk to storms, fires, heat waves, and drought. Even if we achieve the goals of Paris, life will not get easier for these people. It's only going to get harder. And that's why WWF is helping people who live in and rely on nature for their livelihoods to adapt to the unavoidable realities of climate change. Our Environment and Disaster Management Program works with humanitarian groups like the Red Cross to ensure that rebuilding after disasters is done with environmentally responsible practices like using sustainably sourced building materials and using nature-based approaches to reduce risk to the next disaster, before the next disaster. Our Climate Crowd program empowers communities to manage their own futures by its supporting activities that reduce their vulnerability to the impacts of climate change while also reducing pressure on nature. For example, as shown in these images in Uganda, we're helping communities build rainwater harvesting systems, in this case out of recycled plastic bottles, to collect water in times of plenty, to save it for times of drought. And when people can no longer rely on their traditional sources of income like farming or fishing, we help communities diversify their livelihoods so when one source of income fails, they have others to fall back on. This is resilience. In Madagascar, for example, where climate change has meant that crops are failing due to prolonged drought, we're helping women in coastal communities grow seaweed to supplement their income. In fact, seaweed offers some exciting potential for climate action. If there's a moonshot for climate, a bold innovation that could harness the power of nature to stabilize the climate, seaweed may just be that moonshot. To tell us more about this, let me introduce Paul Dobbins, our Senior Director for Impact Investing and Ecosystem Services.
Thank you, Shaun, and hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to present seaweed farming as a scalable and economically sustainable nature-based solution. Seaweed, or macroalgae, grows in all the world's oceans. Scientists estimate there are over 12,000 species of seaweeds, and the seaweeds are divided into three groups: the reds, the greens, and the browns. The browns are more commonly known as kelps, and it is sugar kelp, which you see growing on the lines on this slide. Asia has farmed seaweed for centuries for use as a food source. Only recently have scientists begun to understand the important beneficial services these farms can provide to ocean waters, the organisms that live in proximity to the farms, and additional uses for seaweeds that will improve our environment. Seaweed provides important ecosystem services for the waters in which they are grown. They act like green plants, taking up CO2, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and they release oxygen through the process of photosynthesis. Research data suggests that globally, seaweed sequesters as much carbon as mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass meadows together. Seaweed farming at scale could take up a significant portion of the CO2 absorbed annually by the world's oceans. Farming just a fraction of the ocean surface could significantly contribute to climate gains. This is the moonshot opportunity that Shaun described. Researchers, supported in part by WWF, are determining the amount of excess nutrients absorbed per hectare by seaweed farms and the naturally occurring carbon sequestration as a result of the life cycle processes of kelps. Early data suggests that the pH of the water within the farms and a halo of water in the surrounding ocean is less acidic, leading to improved shellfish health and productivity. Later this year, we will learn the results of research taking place on 26 farms around the world to measure the amount of carbon sequestered in the ocean bottom that can be traced back to seaweed farms. Seaweed farms are incredibly efficient production systems. They operate on the surface and use depths down to 40 feet. This is true 3D farming. They produce up to 107 tons per hectare, and the yields per hectare are increasing through strain selection. This compares favorably with sugarcane, which yields 60 to 70 tons, and potatoes that yield about 45 tons. And seaweed farms do not require any arable land, fresh water, fertilizers, or pesticides. Relative to other food production systems, seaweed farms are highly efficient. This slide, produced by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, highlights sugar kelp. This is a brown seaweed that grows at high latitudes in the Eastern Pacific and the North Atlantic Rim. In addition to improving the water chemistry and providing nutritious biomass with low inputs, seaweed farming can create coastal community resilience. The first commercial seaweed farm in the US began in 2009, and there are now over 200 fishing families that are farming seaweed on our coasts. They are able to employ assets they already own, along with their great on-the-water knowledge and experience, to create income in the winter, during which they historically fished for shrimp and cod, two fisheries that have collapsed. The objective of our project is to accelerate the growth of the seaweed industry so that in the future, the scale of farms will allow us to realize meaningful climate benefits, and the harvest will contribute significantly to the world's biomass supply. Our strategy is threefold: provide access to capital for early-stage companies developing innovation that will enable scale, improve social license for farms to operate in the commons, the ocean, and accelerate market development to enable farm production to expand. Scientists estimate there are over 3.1 million square kilometers that have the nutrients that will support seaweed farms. The vast majority of this space is offshore in the exposed open ocean. Last year, WWF made its first equity investment in Ocean Rainforest. This company is located in the Faroes, an archipelago situated in the North Atlantic Rim, midway between Iceland and Norway. This past winter, with funds provided by WWF's investment, the company installed a new farm design offshore that survived 150-mile-an-hour winds and 30-plus-foot seas. And the farm yield improved 22% relative to protected water farms. If the farm continues to survive and perform well Over the next few years, it will show that much of these 3.1 million square kilometers will be farmable. Last week, WWF announced its second investment. This investment in Oceanium, a Scottish-based biorefiner of seaweed, will fund the development of feedstocks for a home compostable alternative to petroleum-based packaging and protein and fiber extracts for human and animal feed. Should Oceanium's technology prove out, it can be employed relatively easy anywhere in the world and create significant demand for more seaweed farms. Through our work, we have identified unconventional yet equally passionate partners for this nature-based solution. The U.S. Department of Energy envisions the day that large seaweed farms provide feedstocks for energy and are co-located within wind farms. Echo, the Danish shoe manufacturer, is keen to co-invest with us to reduce the impacts of leather production through seaweed feed supplements that reduce enteric methane production in rumens. WWF is uniquely positioned to support seaweed farming as a nature-based solution. The projects we are working on will accelerate the growth of seaweed farming to the point where industry contributes meaningfully to improving our climate and our society. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to Marcene.
Great. Well, thank you, Paul. It's very exciting and innovative work that you're doing, and we look forward to seeing the results of that. Now, suffice it to say, we've covered a lot of territory here. The three big takeaways I'd like you to remember is that in addressing the climate crisis, WWF is first trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through its work with corporations and other non-state actors, as well as the federal government. Two, we're trying to increase carbon sinks through our nature-based solutions and other innovative ways of using nature to address climate change. And three, we recognize that climate change and global warming is coming and is going to impact our most vulnerable communities. And so we are working with those communities to help them adapt and become resilient to the changes that are coming. But I'm sure that you have a lot of other questions. And so I'm going to turn this over and bring in Andrew Wiley, who leads WWF's Partners in Conservation program, to moderate our Q&A. Andrew?
Thank you, Marcene and Marty and Mariana and Shaun and Paul. All of you are doing such tremendous work, and it's important for all of us to know all of what you're doing as we accelerate our work to address the climate crisis. So our first question is from Anne, and I think, Marty, this is probably good for you. Are many companies using carbon credits, and can they somehow be incentivized to do so?
Yes. For many years, companies have purchased offsets or carbon credits to help meet their goals. As I said earlier, sometimes those don't quite live up to the standards of really having the impact of being as permanent and credible reductions. So that's why we're spending so much time working on ensuring their credibility. But over time, we're going to see companies, and from WWF's standpoint, we'd like them, if they're going to use carbon credits, they should be using them to supplement the actions they're taking to reduce their own emissions in their value chain and their own operations. So there are quite a few initiatives today to help scale up carbon credits, and WWF is playing a role in many of them to try to both ensure their integrity and that they can scale up to the levels that are going to be necessary in order to drive the sort of the climate benefits and the nature benefits that we'd like to see.
Great, thanks, Marty. There's another question here that's probably best for Shaun. It touches on some of the things that you mentioned in your piece of this. We're on the cusp of this year's hurricane season here in the US, which seems to get longer and more intense every year. With that in mind, can you just tell us a little more about the environment and disaster management work at WWF?
Yeah, sure, thank you. Yeah, yesterday, or June 1st, was the beginning of the hurricane season. Last year's hurricane season, we ran out of names in the alphabet. We had to go all the way to Iota. Eta and Iota hit the country of Honduras within 2 weeks and just really devastated communities and nature in that country. and unleashed a new wave of immigration towards the United States. Our environment and disaster management work goes way back to 2004 when the Asian tsunami, earthquake and tsunami devastated coastal communities in Asia. And the Red Cross called upon us to help us look at rebuilding people's livelihoods in a sustainable way. And what we quickly realized is that the way that communities were rebuilding was having a huge toll on nature. If you can imagine, the community of the city of Aceh in northern Sumatra was just devastated, and that city had to be rebuilt. What took hundreds of years to build had to be replaced with like in a year. And we're trying to protect the forests of Sumatra. So you look around, you have to rebuild your homes. What are you gonna do? You're gonna cut down the local timber to rebuild your homes. And that really was a wake-up call for us. So we said, can't do that. We need to build brick homes. That will be safer and stronger and avoid using the timber local resources. And thereby we could save nature by doing that. We had a rude awakening when we learned that it took 4 times as much wood to fire bricks as it did if you were just to build homes with wood in the first place. And that led us to a whole multi-year partnership with the Red Cross to really look at the recovery reconstruction process after a disaster, and to make sure that we are using environmentally sustainable practices. Even things that we thought were environmentally sustainable turned out not to be. And in 2013, we won the Green Star Award from the United Nations for that work with the Red Cross. And it continues to this day. Our senior director for that program, Anita Van Breda, is called into action almost every other month with a crisis or an emergency that's happening somewhere in the world.
All right, I have a cool question for Paul. I think people are they're excited by the idea of this moonshot of seaweed. So the question here is from Jeff. Are there any limitations on the locations for seaweed farming, wherever they're located around in the ocean? And can any company just go in and start a seaweed operation in international waters? How does it all work?
Sure. So the limitations for where seaweed farms can grow are, first, what is the carrying capacity or ability for that seaweed to thrive in the environment? Are there enough nutrients? And just as importantly, what are the existing uses in those waters? So our waters and waters of other countries are very busy. We have commercial fishing, we have defense, logistics, recreation, and the environment. So we want to protect certain areas of our water from any kind of commercial use. Many parts of our waters are already used commercially. And so the process involved in figuring out where a company or an individual can go in and put a farm is regulated by a series of laws at the state level, and they're quite good at protecting the environment, existing use, and providing opportunity for someone to get into the water, or a company to get into the water and farm. Once you're out beyond the 3-mile limit into federal waters, the US right now is developing a set of regulations that will allow that activity to occur. There are only 2 sites in federal waters. One is operated by the University of New Hampshire, and the other is off the coast of Southern California, and these are research sites. So eventually there'll be regulation allowing for this activity to take place in federal waters. When you get out beyond the EEZ, right now the technology doesn't exist to be able to farm in that type of environment.
Well, I guess we'll have to see what the next few years holds for that. I think if we're going to try this moonshot, we will see how it expands and how quickly. I have a question here for Mariana about the portion of the conversation. You mentioned that the ACA has 3 areas of work, and that together they create sort of a domino effect that leads to significant emissions reductions when they're all totaled up together. Can you tell us more about some of the partnerships from around the world that are playing a role in this climate action pillar as an example? And what are the relationships that are helping to move the needle on this?
Thank you. Well, as I mentioned before, the Alliances for Climate Action represents the collective effort of many institutions. And one of the institutions that we're partnering with is the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, also known as the UNFCCC, and the countries that have just presided and are currently presiding the negotiations, which are Chile and the United Kingdom. They have created a global campaign called the Race to Zero campaign, which aims to recognize those subnational and non-state actor institutions that are fully aligning with the goal of reducing their emissions in a way that aligns with the 1.5 degree goal that we discussed before. So in order to align with that, there are several requirements that are included in that. One is to set a net zero goal of 2050 or sooner. The other one is to develop an ambitious goal of reducing emissions by 50% by 2030. So that's an interim goal. Another requirement is to show that institutions have concrete actions underway to deliver on both of those goals. And finally, that they are disclosing publicly both their commitments and their progress, which is something that only a subset of institutions currently do. So the campaign is global, but it needs help reaching every corner of the world. And so the UNFCCC Race to Zero campaign has approached WWF and Alliances for Climate Action and our partners to join forces so that we can amplify this campaign supported by the United Nations, so that we can actually amplify the campaign and encourage more actors to join, and that we do so in the local languages. So with the help with signatories that are already part of Alliances for Climate Action and also part of the Race to Zero campaign, we are now spreading the word, and we are working to encourage more institutions to join, because ultimately what we want is not only to have this momentum grow globally, this momentum of alignment with 1.5, but what we also want is to create critical mass around key countries so that institutions that are aligned with 1.5 can drive the decarbonization of key sectors like energy, agriculture, transport, forest, and others, and can also call on their governments and inspire their governments to set policies that align with that. So we are very excited about this partnership. We are both working locally with a global reach, and we are very grateful to the UNFCCC for their confidence in us, and we are excited about the work ahead.
Fantastic. I have another question for Paul about seaweed. I think people are very interested in this idea. It was that in the slides, there were a number of women featured who were doing the work there on the boats and seaweed work. Just curious about how seaweed compares to other ocean industries in that regard.
Seaweed is a unique ocean industry in that it is dominated by women. There are estimated to be over 5 million women globally that participate in seaweed farming or processing of seaweeds. And there are a number of cultural and economic reasons for this. But what's consistent across the board, whether you're in North America or you're in Madagascar or Indonesia or Europe, is that women are leading the way. They're the CEOs of the processing facilities. They are the operators of farms, and they are doing a significant amount of the cutting edge research that's taking place around seaweed farming today.
All right, we're coming to the end of our session here. So I just have one final question, and thanks again to all of you for sharing your work with us today. But I'm gonna leave this with you, Marcene. In closing, what do you think is next for us in climate this year? Where does WWF go from here, from this amazing presentation on our work? What can we look forward to?
Well, great. Well, thank you. So there's just a lot of opportunity for WWF going forward. And some of the areas that I'd like us to explore, one is in terms of this is the decade of action. So we need to figure out, how do we scale up quickly? And one of the ways of scaling up is through bringing finance to the area. We know that our traditional methods of financing, which has been just government and philanthropy, will not be enough. And I think Nick talked about this a little bit, and Carter did as well, how we need to start bringing in the private sector, how we need to bring all parties together in something what we would call blended finance, where we blend and leverage government investment with private sector investment and philanthropic investment. So I'm really looking forward to taking from my background at IFC in finance and climate finance and bringing that to WWF. So that's one area that I think is really interesting. We also need to, and this is a longer term goal, but look at the impacts of this transition, this energy transition, this transition to low carbon economy, and what that has on nature. And this is both in mitigation and resilience. Shaun gave great examples about how he was trying to be resilient and found out that it had other climate impacts, and that wasn't the way. We need to think about, if we're going to invest heavily in, say, wind technology and offshore wind, what impact does that have, positive or negative, on our oceans? If we're doing wind farms in the northern Great Plains, how does that impact our farmers? If we are building solar installations, what impact does that have on nature? So I think, again, we're in a very good position of looking at that in terms of infrastructure and the impacts, and I'm really excited about that. So those are just two examples on top of the things that you heard about today, where WWF can play a unique role in addressing this climate crisis.
Thanks, Marcene, and thanks to all of you here. We're very excited to learn all of this about WWF's climate work, and there is no time to lose. So thanks for telling us how all things are going on our climate work today.